Welcome to Drive Through History, where this time we are going to look at American beginnings. We'll start in Europe and explore the amazing story of the famous explorer and entrepreneur Christopher Columbus. You'll drive along with me to Genoa, Italy, his hometown by the sea. Then we'll travel through some exotic Italian countryside to beautiful and historic Florence, where we'll learn about where Columbus may have found some of the inspiration for his big idea. After that, we'll cross over to Spain, where we'll see about the value of persistence. It was here that Columbus was broke, hungry, and dejected, and almost gave up. Oh, and we'll meet a guy who hangs around Spain named Eduardo. And along the way, we'll answer that age-old question, what did Mongol warrior Genghis Khan and the Prophet Muhammad have to do with the discovery of America? Well, as it turns out, plenty. Is your passport up to date? Our first destination in our look into America's rearview mirror is an exotic seaport city in northern Italy, a city named Genoa. Well, I'm driving around beautiful Genoa, Italy, on the western coast of northern Italy, the hometown to one Christopher Columbus. Columbus was born in 1451, and this was his boyhood home. He was raised in the shadows of these medieval city gates behind him and the sea in front of him, the perfect backdrop for a boy looking for adventure. Columbus set about learning his trade as a teenager, not surprising for a boy from Genoa. He traveled the trade routes across Europe and may have even sailed as far north as Iceland, all the while becoming an expert in navigation. He also claimed to have helped do a bit of privateering in the war against the Moors. Christopher Columbus had reached his goal of becoming a sea captain, but he was not content to simply follow the traditional trade routes and make a nice living. No, Christopher Columbus had plans, big plans. No, make that huge plans. And he was willing to risk everything he had worked for to make them a reality. Well, I'm walking through Genoa, Italy, on the trail of all things Christopher Columbus. And this is the great Columbus Piazza. Not a lot here commemorating the man, but at least he has a piazza, which is nice. One of the things I've noticed traveling around Europe is that many cities in Europe have a graffiti problem. But here in Genoa, I think they've kind of run out of ideas for gang symbols. But hey, you know, different strokes for different folks. Now, history is more than just about remembering dates. It's also about the confluence of events. One of the things we like to do in Drive Through History is to connect the dots, those seemingly unrelated events that add up to some amazing moment or turning point in history. It's kind of like the butterfly effect. You know how one event can set another event in motion and eventually affect things on the other side of the world? Or like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Ever heard of it? Oh, well, never mind. I don't even need 6 degrees of separation to make my case. 1 or 2 is just fine. So here is my case. I contend that but for Jesus Christ, Marco Polo, Pope Gregory X, the Prophet Muhammad, Mongol warrior Genghis Khan, and an obscure mathematician in Florence, Columbus never makes his amazing discovery. Okay, I agree that's an unusual take on history, but hear me out. First, the Khan man. Genghis Khan was a Mongol political and military leader, or Khan, who sometimes brutally conquered and united the Mongol tribes and founded the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous empire in world history. He forged a powerful army and became one of the most significant and successful military leaders in history. The Mongol Empire then ended up ruling, or at least briefly conquering, large parts of modern-day China,
Mongolia, Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Moldova, South Korea, North Korea,
and Kuwait. You guys got all that, right? This made Genghis Khan the most successful empire builder ever, and after his death, it would grow even larger under his son and grandson. Mongol armies pushed into Persia and gained control of all of China. Genghis Khan's huge empire brought a cohesive and peaceful political environment. This allowed increased communication and trade between the West, Middle East, and Asia. This openness meant that these two previously separate worlds could begin to trade with each other. In the late 1200s, a Venetian explorer named Marco Polo became one of the first Europeans to travel what would later be called the Silk Road to China. Polo, together with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo, traveled to China visiting Kublai Khan, the then ruler and grandson of the great Genghis Khan. The Silk Road was a series of interconnected trade routes through various regions of the Eurasian continent, mainly connecting China with Asia Minor and the Mediterranean. It extended over 5,000 miles on land and sea, and as we will see, this trade helped to lay the foundations for the modern world.
Let's burn off some pasta, Italian stallion style. I'm good, I'm just tying my shoe, dogs. You know, can't run with shoes untied, you know? So, just tying those shoes. All right, this next section is for the tiramisu.
So how do we know all this? It's because Marco Polo glorified his adventures in riding while doing a little time out in a prison right here in Genoa. And as is the case with much of history, we remember the guys with good PR, and his book became a runaway bestseller. Not an easy feat during a time before the printing press was even invented. Marco Polo was doing time in prison because the two city-states of Venice and Genoa had a brief little war. Marco was fighting for Venice because that was his hometown, and was captured, thus landing him in the slammer right here in Genoa. It'd be funny if I hit one and they all just kind of... Many people scoffed at Marco Polo's exploits, thinking that they were pure fantasy. But almost 200 years later, Christopher Columbus, who grew up right here in Genoa, Italy, would read Marco Polo's book and became enamored with the idea of visiting these strange lands that Marco Polo described. Columbus would eventually decide that he would pick up where Marco Polo left off. In his book, Marco Polo explains that Kublai Khan was delighted with the Polos. He listened eagerly to all they had to tell of their world and decided to send them back as his envoys to the Pope. The great Khan wrote letters to the Pope and requested that he send a large body of educated men to instruct his empire in Christianity. Writing of the Khan's request to the Pope, Polo says this: his object, he told them, was to make a request to His Holiness that he would send him 100 men of learning, thoroughly acquainted with the principles of the Christian religion, as well as with the 7 arts, and qualified to prove to the learned of his dominions, by just and fair argument, that the faith professed by Christians is superior to, and founded on more evident truth than any other, that the gods of the Tartars and the idols worshipped in their house were only evil spirits, and the people of the East in general were in error in reverencing them as divinities. This is a pretty amazing time in world history. Genghis Khan's grandson, the leader of the largest empire ever assembled in human history, issues an open invitation, a red carpet to the Pope in Rome, so that he could Christianize and westernize the remaining known world. This is a really big deal. To fully appreciate it, you need to learn a little something about Christian teaching. In Christian tradition, the Great Commission is the instruction of the resurrected Jesus Christ to his disciples that they spread the faith to all the nations of the world. Here is what it says: all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. In November of 1268, 3 long years later, the travel-weary Polo brothers arrived in Rome, letters of Kublai Khan in hand. The only problem is that Pope Clement IV had just died. It would be more than 2 years before a new pope was named. And for reasons we do not completely understand, the new pope, Pope Gregory X, did not fulfill the request. Instead, he sent gifts, letters, and only 2, not 100, well-educated friars back to the great Khan. But on their way to China, the group fell into a war zone. Muslim warriors operating under the Sultan of Egypt had captured the most important centers of Armenia and were slaughtering the inhabitants as they went. The Polos were accustomed to the dangers of this trade route, but the friars, fearing for their lives, handed the gifts and letters over to the Polos and returned to Rome under escort by the Knights Templar. One of the greatest opportunities for the spread of Christianity was thus lost, and China would eventually turn to Buddhism for its moral framework. A rising Islamic threat would virtually close the Silk Road, and trade with Europe would be restricted to the sea. And then finally, in 1452, when Christopher Columbus was a mere lad of 1 year old, Muslim leader Mohammed II, otherwise known as Mehmet, laid siege to Constantinople, the last safe refuge to European trading. From that point on, trading with India and China was a very hazardous undertaking because there were no safe havens from Muslim attack and piracy. For more on this story, I needed to drive west for a few hours and travel to beautiful Florence, Italy. The need was dire, and the incentives were great to find another way around and continue the trade that had been cut off by Mohammed II. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention, and it would be Christopher Columbus that would step up to the plate.
You know, for every big guy who gets all the credit, there's an army of unnamed people behind them. Back in 1492, if they had given out Explorers Awards, Columbus would have gotten one, gotten up and thanked his mother, and then not too far down the list, he would have thanked a guy who spent a lot of time toiling away in this cathedral right behind me. Spent a lot of time charting stars and doing math calculations so that one day Columbus could get all the credit. Paolo Toscanelli, from right here in Florence, Italy, was a big fan of geography. So he was a student and fan of the Marco Polo books. Well, based on Marco Polo's books, he calculated that there was about 5,000 miles between the Canary Islands and the coastline of China. He was a little off. There were a couple of continents in between. But that's nitpicking, isn't it? Forget about it.
So trade between India, China, and Europe dwindled, and it was Islam that had effectively created a blockade. So you can imagine that many Europeans were wondering, how do we solve this problem? Years later, as Columbus reflected on his great journey, he wrote to his benefactors, the King and Queen of Spain, and gave God, not science, the credit for his discovery. Columbus writes this: "At this time I have seen and put into study to look into all the scriptures, cosmology, histories, chronicles, and philosophy, and other arts which the Lord has opened to my understanding. I could sense his hand upon me, so it became clear to me that it was feasible to navigate from here to the Indies, and he locked within me the determination to execute this idea. And I came to your highness with this ardor. All those who heard about my enterprise rejected it with laughter, scoffing at me. Neither the sciences which I mentioned above, nor the authoritative citations from them were of any avail. In only your highnesses remained faith and constancy. Who doubts the illumination of the Holy Spirit?"
And now if I can bring this story full circle. The brutal Genghis Khan assembles an empire, thus creating peace, establishing order, and trade with Europe. The great Khan's grandson creates an opportunity that is missed by Pope Gregory X. But nevertheless, trade is established and popularized by the exploits and writings of Marco Polo. This trade, shortly thereafter, is shut down by the followers of Mohammed, thus creating a crisis in Europe. Then along comes a mathematician toiling away quietly at this cathedral here in Florence, who proposes a new theory of reaching the east by sailing west. And then along comes Christopher Columbus, who believes he's called by God to find a new trade route and fulfill the Great Commission. He sells that theory to the King and Queen of Spain, thus setting into motion one of the greatest changes in the course of human history. What I was trying to do is this. Oh! Oh, great. Now look what happened. Let's go. Before Christopher Columbus could set sail, he needed official sponsorship from a throne. He needed some dinero, some cashish, some bling. He needed the kind of cha-ching you could only get from a king. Or in this case, a king and a queen. So around the year 1485, Columbus came up with a bold proposal, which is why we find ourselves here in Spain.
Columbus had spent 20 years traveling through Europe trying to meet with any royalty that would listen to his pitch. He had given his medieval PowerPoint presentation to the King of Portugal, possibly as early as 1471, then years later to England and France. Every time he was rejected. Columbus, often traveling with his son Diego, was rejected on multiple occasions in Spain in the 1490s. His idea was too extreme, too risky. The timing was just wrong. Columbus was out of options. What he needed was a miracle. A convent seemed like a good place to find one.
When Christopher Columbus knocked on the doors of this place, he was at the lowest point of his entire life. He was penniless, hungry, couldn't even afford food to eat, with his young son Diego in tow. The two had been all over Europe speaking before kings, looking for money to fund his voyage to no avail. But it was two monks from right here that took him in, fed him, and took care of him. But little did Columbus know that these two monks weren't your normal monks. They had friends in high places.
One of the monks, Father Juan Perez, was a friend and supporter of Columbus. Columbus explained that his last resort was going to be one more meeting with the King of France. But Father Perez decided it was time to use his connections. You see, one of Father Perez's duties was to hear the confessions of the Queen of Spain.
Christopher Columbus was allowed entry into the royal court of Spain, where he made his big pitch to the monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella.
But this time things had changed. After 700 years of Islamic domination of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella had successfully defeated the Muslims, called the Spanish Moors, in a recent battle.
They had driven the Moors out of the key port city of Granada down in southern Spain. Peace had broken out across the country and Spain was unified, and they were in the mood to expand.
Columbus got virtually everything he had hoped and prayed for. He had found royal patrons which took care of the financing he needed for ships, supplies, and crews. He had even asked for, if you will, a piece of the action. If he discovered gold or other riches, he would get a percentage of everything, along with getting the naming rights and becoming the ruler of any new lands he discovered. Columbus would set sail from the Spanish town of Palos de la Frontera. It was here that he gathered most of his crew, including the Pinzon brothers, who were local men famous for their navigational skills and who would captain the Nina and Pinta. This is an amazing place to visit. There's just so much Christopher Columbus history here. You don't want to miss it on your next trip to Spain. We even found the church where word of the fantastic voyage would be announced, the holy place where Columbus and his men attended their sacred sending-off ceremony.
I'm here in St. George the Martyr Church in Palos, Spain. It's where Columbus got the green light for his famous voyage. It's where the royal Spanish decree was read that provided ships and a crew for Columbus's voyage. Imagine the excitement that would have been generated from this little church in this small village. On August 3rd, 1492, Christopher Columbus and some 90 other mariners boarded their ships right here in Palos, Spain, and set sail in the three famous boats, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. It'd be nice if we saw some land. Have you seen the bathrooms on this place? You getting any cell service?
Well, I think we all know what happened next. Columbus had a fairly easy journey, good weather and fair winds, and found America. Well, okay, he initially thought that he had found China, but it was actually the Bahamas. But that's another story.
Word had traveled fast. News of Columbus's fantastic exploits had exploded across the continent. And even before he had made it back to be greeted once again by his royal sponsors, the story of his first voyage was already in its third printing. Columbus was received and regarded as a hero in his adopted home of Spain and in his native Italy. Eduardo, would you please stop swinging on the ropes while we're filming? And please give me back my puffy shirt. Despite the fact that Christopher Columbus was not the first European to set foot in America, his expeditions were nevertheless monumentally influential because they helped flame passions for expansion and settlement of the New World.
By the way, have you ever wondered why Columbus named his ship the Santa Maria? He never wanted to forget where he had nearly lost hope, but found his miracle. And in case your Spanish is a bit rusty, in English, Santa Maria means Saint Mary, the Mother of Christ.
Now this is the way to see Florence. Ah! Okay, quick. Who was the second guy to land on the moon? You don't know, do you? How about the first? You think the moon landing was a giant conspiracy? We're off to a great start here. Well, the point I was trying to make was this, that nobody remembers the second guy in anything. You know, the position sometimes known as the first place loser. Well, with my apologies to Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, allow me to continue. At the same time that Columbus was born in Genoa, one of Italy's future explorers was born right here in Florence. His name was Amerigo Vespucci. At the time of his birth, Florence was considered ground zero for the Renaissance. It is said that of the 1,000 most important artists and scientists, over 350 of them came from right here. I'm talking about Michelangelo, Donatello, Leonardo, Raphael. Their lives intersected with Columbus and Vespucci, and they changed the way we think about art and science. They created masterpieces like the Mona Lisa, the Sistine Chapel, and the Pieta at St. Peter's Cathedral. Oh, and over 500 years later, they would serve as the inspiration for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But I digress.
And so while great works of art and science were being produced in Florence, its most famous explorer and mapmaker, Amerigo Vespucci, was commissioned by the King and Queen of Spain to further investigate the new lands discovered by Christopher Columbus. Between 1499 and 1502, Vespucci discovered the landmass we now call South America. He was convinced this land was part of a new continent, a bold contention at a time when other European explorers crossing the Atlantic Ocean thought they were reaching Asia. So it is Amerigo Vespucci that is generally given the credit for figuring out Columbus had found a whole new world and not India and China. In 1507, Martin Waldseemüller produced a world map on which he named the new continent America. But why America? Well, Waldseemüller took Amerigo Vespucci's first name and Latinized it to Americus because at the time, Latin was the universal language for European maps. But Americus is a man's name, and Mr. Waldseemüller, as a highly trained map-making professional, knew that continents, like ships, are always female. So Waldseemüller took it upon himself to feminize Americus to America, and the rest is history. But you might ask, who was Amerigo named after in the first place? Well, you can trace his name back to the somewhat obscure 11th century Hungarian Saint Americ, whose bones are still an object of veneration in Hungary today. So the name America stuck because other people copied Waldseemüller's map, and soon the name was in common use. That is why we have North and South America, and not North and South Colombia. The Columbus family has never quite gotten over it. So, in review, 2 Spanish monarchs commissioned an Italian explorer to survey what they thought was India and China. And then a German mapmaker decided to call it America, the Latinized female version of the Italian explorer whose name originated from the 11th century Hungarian saint. I'm glad I could clear that up for you.
And that is how America got its name, and how the number 2 guy acquired naming rights for 2 continents, forever saving himself from the obscurity of forever being second banana. Viva la Genoa! I have no idea where I am. And that's a really good feeling. Got the paparazzi here in Florence. What am I gonna have to do? Drive through Des Moines? Hey! Thanks, Mom. Bye, kids. It's great having you along. It really is.